just as many of the arguments presented in that movie were phony, were false. So here's another scientific challenge, challenge number 2. If there have been many other cycles, and if the ice cap is melting on Mars, just as it is here, how can this climate cycle be a result of human activity rather than solar activity? Which brings us to the theory of just what man does that supposedly creates global warming. Well, this allegation is based on the well-promoted theory that greenhouse gases, and according to the alarmists, CO2 is by far the worst culprit, are trapped. These greenhouse gases, and thus CO2, the worst one of all, are trapping heat in the atmosphere, and the increase of CO2 levels is thus leading to a disastrous jump in the Earth's temperature. So let's look at this theory. I don't dismiss it. Let's look at it. Let's answer it. I wish the American people and the rest of us were paid an equal amount of respect by those people, the alarmists, who are advocating the man-made global warming theory. So let's look at this. Let's look at their theory now and give it an honest look. With all the hoopla about CO2, non-scientists might believe that it is a huge part of the atmosphere. I want everybody my colleagues and everyone listening, to ask themselves, what percentage do you think that CO2 is of the atmosphere? Well, they think that most people think it's a huge part. Some people I've asked have actually suggested it was between maybe 40 and 60% of the atmosphere. Well, that's wrong. Wrong. People have been given a false impression. CO2, carbon dioxide, is a minuscule part of our atmosphere. And as I say, most of the people I've talked to, even the highly educated ones, have thought that CO2 makes up maybe 25, maybe 40, maybe one guy even said 60% of the atmosphere. In reality, it is less than, get into this, CO2 is less than 0.04% of the atmosphere. So CO2 is not even 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of the atmosphere. Not even 1/2 of 1%, not even 1/2 of 10% of 1%. This is a minuscule part of the atmosphere that we have been led to believe is having this dramatic impact on weather patterns. And where did the minuscule amount of this CO2, I mean, even though it's as small as it is, 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of the atmosphere, where did that minuscule amount come from? With all the hoopla, one would assume that most of the atmosphere's CO2 can be traced to human activity. Nope. At least 70% of the CO2 in our atmosphere has a natural source and has nothing to do with human activity. I have been in science committee hearings where very prominent scientists have suggested that it might be 80 or 90% of the CO2 in the atmosphere coming from natural sources. But let's say, okay, at least 70%. So the part of the atmosphere that is CO2 generated by man is even less than minuscule. It is a minor part of a minuscule component. And if we suppress our standard of living enough to eliminate even 1/10 of man's contribution, then one big volcano or maybe some forest fires could totally undo this supposed reduction in CO2. And to get a 10% reduction means a dramatic attack on the standard of living of our people and the reallocation of trillions of dollars. We are to give up our own freedom and prosperity and hand over such power, as I have just mentioned, to a global government or even to a centralized federal government here in the United States, all for that, for a step forward that could be erased by a big volcano or perhaps a series of forest fires? That's insane. Well, undaunted, the alarmists point to increases in CO2, which they label as alarming. Of course, that's why they're alarmists. They call it alarming. Starting from such a minuscule level, however, It's like using a phony temperature baseline, like they did with the end of the mini ice age, but using that as their baseline at the minuscule level of CO2, this can distort the importance of when someone says that there's been a rise in the amount of CO2, because to begin with, it's a very, very minuscule amount, part of our atmosphere. So if there's an increase in that, it's not going to have the same impact as what most people have led to believe, the people who believe that it's 40% of our atmosphere. But this increase, of course, no matter what, has been described to us in such sinister terms that we are supposed to believe that it is making the world hotter. And so it's mankind, by increasing CO2, making the world hotter. When trying to pull this off, they don't mention that in recent times, CO2 levels, yes, have increased. But contrary to the alarmist theory, the Earth's temperatures have gone down. Remember, we are being told that the rise of CO2, which is a minuscule part of our thing, but the rise of the CO2 in our atmosphere is causing the atmosphere to warm. Again, there are clearly times when CO2 has been going up, but the temperature has gone down. So science challenge number 3, if man-made CO2, which is a minuscule part of a minuscule element of the atmosphere, if that causes warming, then why is it that when mankind has been emitting more and more CO2, like in the 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s, and at that same time when CO2 levels in general were rising, why was there an actual cooling going on in our climate? This is true today, too. We have an increase in CO2, but there's been a cooling going on, or at least there hasn't been a warming for the last 10 years. Remember, no matter how they've tried to hide it, and that attempt to hide it is very clear in the emails that have just been exposed, no matter how they try to hide it, global temperatures have not gone up for almost a decade. It should be noted that scientific ice core specialists now tell us that historically, over a course of 500 years, CO2 increases followed temperature increases. It would appear that when it gets warmer, the Earth produces more CO2. The alarmists have it totally backwards, and they're using that as an excuse to dramatically increase their power to control our lives. It is a flawed theory. It is the warmer Earth that creates the CO2 increase, not the other way around. But that would mean, of course, human beings, if they accept that it's the Earth and it's the warming of the Earth that creates more CO2, that would mean that us human beings, that we're off the hook. And the globalists would have no excuse for their power grab and no excuse to control us, to tax us, and to regulate away our livelihood. Well, it's not getting any warmer, and contrary to those trying to frighten us into giving up our freedom, CO2 is not a threat to the planet and is not a pollutant. It is not harmful to human beings or animals. It is food for plants, which then give off oxygen. Throughout the world, greenhouses, sometimes they're called hothouses, are growing vegetables by pumping CO2 to feed the plants. And they end up, after pumping CO2 into these hothouses, they end up with bigger, juicier tomatoes, berries, and other crops. CO2 is not a threat to human health or a threat to the planet. During ancient times, before human beings, there were much higher levels of CO2 in the air, and life on this planet flourished. Even in the oceans, which were, yes, more acidic, ocean life was robust and abundant at that time. All of this makes the announcement yesterday that the EPA will treat CO2 as a pollutant all the more astounding and, yes, repugnant. It is an example of the heavy-handed power grab we are up against. By declaring CO2 a